Player-friendly.
Call Raymond home.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chair. The minister who just resumed his seat said about the reality, and according to him, according to the minister, the reality was that the savings and the scheme has been more than doubled, and by pure mathematics, that more than doubled figure would have been doubled further if the National/Act government did not cut the contribution by half. Well, to be fair to the minister in the chair, there are good initiatives in this part 2, and other parts, and we will talk about the good initiatives when we move on. But to be equally fair to the general public and the New Zealand taxpayers and voters, I think the minister would appreciate the difference between the two words, that is, botch and ditch. What the national government ditched was the compulsory superannuation scheme in December 1975. And what this current National/Act government has botched was the Kiwi Saver. And also they are still botching the scheme. If only Maudome and the national government of the day had not terminated the scheme, it would now be worth more than 240 billion New Zealand dollars and transformed the New Zealand economy into a world beater over the past 30 years. Mr. Chair, according to Brian Gaynor and other leading economists, Maudome's dreadful political decision instead transformed New Zealand from the potential Switzerland of the southern hemisphere into a low-ranking OECD economy. And it was the worst economic decision in the past 40 years. Well, Chinese community would appreciate the dire consequences, and the dire consequences and also the ripples of that decision are still being felt to this date. In fact, if the scheme wasn't ditched, then New Zealand would be much better positioned economically, would be able to own many more assets, and would not incur that much crown debt. And talking about the crown debt, I enjoyed the questions for or answer or Q&A in this House between the Right Honourable Prime Minister John Key and the Right Honourable Winston Peters in May. According to that Q&A, at the end of 2008, crown debt was at $6 billion. It increased to $50 billion in 2011 and National/Act government, and is expected to reach $75 billion by 2015. So back to that superannuation scheme ditched by the national government in December 1975, and based on the $240 billion projection each worker, $240 billion, and based on that projection, each worker would have $111,200 of superannuation assets, compared with the current, how much? $6,300 and $86,821 Australian dollars in Australia. The scheme would represent 146% of GDP, whereas Australian superannuation, which is considered to be the benchmark for the world, represents only 82% of their GDP. That's according to Brian Gaynor. That's in 2007, the projection. As a result of the Australian scheme, the average 30-year-old Australian is expected to retire with superannuation savings of about 400,000 Australian dollars now, and that's according to Devon Funds in 2010. Mr. Chair, Australia started their superannuation scheme after the New Zealand scheme of the 1970s and have accumulated assets. Mr. Chair,
Raymond Ho.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Australia started their superannuation scheme much later than the New Zealand scheme, which was ditched by the national government in 1975, and the Australian scheme has since accumulated assets of over 1.3 trillion Australian dollars, growing at over 100 billion Australian dollars per annum. So based on this, Mr. Chair, Australian banks were able to recapitalize during the depth of the global financial crisis. Indeed, Mr. John Hayes, Australia now intends to lift the current contribution to compulsory super from 9% of wages to 12%. And it's also interesting to note that in Singapore, the contribution is 20% of wages. So when National came into power in 2008, as a couple of my learned colleagues mentioned in previous contributions, the National/ACT government cut KiwiSaver, which is similar to the compulsory superannuation in the 1975, from 4% of the workers' contribution to 2%. Well, for the information of that Minister, Judith Collins, for the first time in 13 years, New Zealand's credit rating was downgraded in September 2011. Worse still, the lower credit rating is likely to increase the costs of borrowing for the New Zealand economy and that national government. And because of New Zealand's poor savings record, thanks to national government and thanks particularly to Prime Minister Robert Maldon, we cannot source those funds domestically, but have to rely on offshore markets, making our position even worse during the global financial crisis. The current National/ACT government has obviously realized it has done something wrong. So through this bill, well, I try to be polite. Through this bill, it intends to raise workers' contribution from 2% to 3%, and National has been flip-flopping all over the place on KiwiSaver, but in general, they have been consistent in their objection to superannuation schemes similar to the one that ditched over 30 years ago and the one they are botching now. I am curious whether the attitude is driven by ideology or it is purely for the sake of it. Maldon's decision over 30 years ago has had dire consequences. Like most Western countries, our population is aging, and by 2050, the ratio of workers per retiree will have fallen from 5 currently to 2, and superannuation costs will have grown from 4% to over 9% of GDP. So thanks to Maldon and his successors, the gap between rich and poor has grown wider in New Zealand. While a small group of rich and privileged are becoming wealthier, New Zealand as a whole has become poorer and is gradually becoming an economic backwater.
John Hayes.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to bring us back to Planet New Zealand.